Thanks for joining us on 7 After 6. I'm Garrett Domblewski, joined tonight by Anthony Velasquez, one of the 4 candidates for Watertown City Council this November. Anthony, I'll start with the thing I've been kind of starting each of these interviews with is what do you consider your platform to be that you're running on, if you have one that you would consider a platform, and what are the sort of top 3 issues that you think the city is facing?
Of course. So my platform really is increasing fixing the affordability of the city of Watertown, fixing the attractiveness, addressing the issues that we face moving forward. Biggest one, and often it seems to be low-hanging fruit, is the budget and the deficits. Really, this has been a long-standing problem, mainly because there's not a lot of long-term planning that the previous councils have engaged with. I don't believe in looking at a budget, next year and making complete decisions. I believe in looking at a budget and projections over the next 5 years and making decisions. So the budget's kind of the top of mind right now, and it will be moving forward. I know we're looking at 20+% property tax rate increases next year, but again, long-term planning, right? If you look at budget projections over the next 5 years, before the hydro contract even expires, which we'll get into, we're looking at 50+% property tax rate increases likely over the next 5 or so years. So that's top of mind for me. Second would be the homelessness issue, and to a lesser extent, the crime issue, which the two, one could argue, are kind of intricately connected. So with the homelessness issue, it's tough because it's an issue that many communities face. Just look at the news. But in the past, in my lifetime, it always has seemed to be a big city issue. We know that there's homeless folks in San Francisco and Seattle and the major metropolitan areas, but it's finally seemed to make its way down to cities like Watertown. And again, not only Watertown, we have increasing homeless population in a lot of municipalities. Cities like Watertown, we need to get creative in addressing it. Some of it comes down to local policy and, affordability and addressing housing shortages, which I would argue there's no housing shortage in Watertown. We have an adequate number of homes. We have a blight issue, and homes are not being taken care of, and we need more affordable housing to be built. So that's the second one. The third one would have to be infrastructure. That's the big one too. So I know that there's a lot of concerns about the water system. I know that there's a lot of concerns about roads. And one thing that I really hear going door to door is sidewalks. I'll throw out one example. I was recently on Bronson Street speaking with some residents, and that road looks like it hasn't been redone in my lifetime. I can't even imagine how residents are able to traverse a street like Bronson Street right now. So really, it's making sure our government's being responsive, making sure we're taking care of those bread and butter, those kitchen table issues, infrastructure, affordability in a city, and increasing the population, increasing the tax base. And big one that's top of mind, being a former military child, my family settled down in the area. I'm not originally from Watertown. My family isn't. Bringing more of these military folks in, especially those nearing retirement with families, and showing them that Watertown is a great place. We're a community that's worth settling down in, and, bring your family and make a life here.
So how would you think that a city council member goes about doing something like that? And we'll start right there with, infrastructure. Maybe that's a little more obvious, but how do you make the city attractive to people who maybe live here for 2 to 5 years and then decide whether they're going to stay or not? How do you do that as a city council member?
Well, infrastructure is a big one. So, when you're not from a city, and I travel frequently, when you're not from an area, one of the first things you do is you look at properties and you look at the roads that you're driving on. And oftentimes, you're on the main streets in a city. So when you look at those main streets, what perception does that leave you with? Do you leave a city saying, that was a charming place and, oh, the people here seem so happy? Or do you see a city and say, oh, it looks like they've neglected infrastructure, and if they're neglecting infrastructure in a city, what else are they neglecting? And one could argue the budget. Word gets around that don't buy a house in Watertown because there's a deficit and they're going to raise taxes. It's a lot of it's perception and optics. Mm-hmm. We need a council that I believe in strength as a leader. So we need strong, decisive leadership that doesn't dance around an issue. And, we're not kicking the can down the road. We're facing these issues head on, and we're addressing them to the best of our abilities. Sure, we're going to make mistakes. That's natural. But, being able to make a decision confidently and to stand by that decision.
So when it comes to infrastructure, water pipelines, sidewalks, what would you do or what would you advocate for if you were elected to city council? How do you get the ball moving in that direction?
Of course. So sidewalks. I believe in taking a big look at the sidewalks in the city of Watertown. I know that there was a sidewalk program at one point in the past. I do think it's high time to bring that program back, especially in some of the more neglected areas on the north side of the city. I forgot which street I was on, which is good to a point. But I actually tripped on a sidewalk walking door to door. And, as a candidate, going door to door, that gives you a unique experience when you're struggling on a specific sidewalk and you wonder about the residents who live on that specific street. Again, how are they feeling when they're walking their dogs or when they're riding a bike on some of these streets? So that's the biggest thing. If there's a budget deficit and taxes are a problem, at least if taxes go up, which, the cost of living always goes up to a point, making those tax increases manageable and realistic, but also showing folks that tax dollars are being spent responsibly, to deal with those infrastructure issues.
So go ahead, you were going to say.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So you mentioned the water issue. Mm-hmm. We've been debating this reservoir for seemingly years now, and it's been leaking, and, we talk about the water leak not costing us money. Well, water is still an asset. There's still some sort of cost that's not necessarily a tangible cost, right? So they've talked about lining it. They've talked about building a new one. The current reservoir that's leaking, I believe, is almost a century old. Again, if we line the reservoir, I believe that that's kicking the can down the road because the useful life is only about 10 to 15 years. I personally, at this point, again, invest in infrastructure. I personally would rather see us just build a new reservoir at this point. And, if it costs $12 to $15 million, think about the fact that a new concrete reservoir, if that's the path that council chooses, will last 50 to 100 years. I think that's a much better use of taxpayer funds than, a short-term Band-Aid solution.
Mm-hmm. What I was going to ask is, when it comes to, choosing what neighborhoods get new sidewalks and such, how would you fund that when you're already looking at large deficits? Where does that money come from if you want to invest in these neighborhoods? Because the city does periodically and regularly do, maybe one street for sidewalks each year or a couple streets. But how do you go about ramping that up without, or where do you find the money to go about doing that?
Well, some of it from a budget standpoint is give and take, right? There's also certain grants that are available through New York State, through revitalization programs, as well as federal grants. Go back to 2017 when we received the downtown revitalization funds. There's these grants available, but again, that's also the cost of doing business. The cost of doing business, our taxes pay for infrastructure. No one loves paying taxes. I know I don't, but at the end of the day, if I'm paying my property taxes and, water and sewer rates are increasing, but we're working on the water system and we're working on these infrastructure items, that at least takes away the sting of any subsequent tax rate increase that might follow.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to homelessness, what do you think the city's role is in curbing that or helping out with finding housing for these folks, or whatever it is that the solution to the situation might be? What would you advocate for on city council?
Definitely. Taking a collaborative whole of community approach. So I know that we have, assembly members that we can keep in the loop. We have our county legislators. At the debate the other night, they were talking about the fact that, certain communities have these task forces. Well, we already have, a street outreach team. They're already kind of collecting the data. It came out recently that their data says that there's 150 homeless folks in the area. I personally believe that number's a little low, just based off of perception and based off of what I've seen. But really, it also comes down to addressing crime. So encampments, unfortunately, right now are kind of a way of life. I don't believe they have to be, but I do support moving the encampments as needed, especially areas impacted near Public Square. So I know the Strauss Walkway was a big one earlier in the fall, late summer. It's those quality of life issues that drive business away and drive residents out of the city, and it kind of leads to this vicious cycle economically and stagnation.
And what do you think that the solution to those problems is, though? As a city council member, what would you be, what alleyway or what pathways do you see as we can do this to accomplish this stated goal? If it's, lessening the number of encampments that are in very public areas, or finding housing that some of the places that'll be opening on the north side in the coming year or so. What can you do, or what would you think that should be done?
Well, a big one is, advocating for and subsequently building affordable housing. I know we have the one going in on Main Ave. I know that there's also the one going in on Commerce Park Drive, which that one I spoke about this several months ago. I had an issue with that one, mainly because of the pilot agreement that was signed. It's very hard, given the budget that we face moving forward, giving these favorable tax conditions to developers from outside of the area. I'd much rather see, any tax breaks given to businesses or industries that want to relocate and bring jobs to our city. Because ultimately, what fixes an economy and what minimizes homelessness is good middle-class jobs, right? It's economic revitalization, and it's effective policy. So I know that there's ordinances that council passed, prohibiting camping at City Hall and prohibiting some of this stuff. These are short-term Band-Aid solutions, but really it's working with folks at the county level. It's working with Assemblyman Gray's office. It's working with, our congressional representatives, folks in Albany, and the federal government as needed.
When you talk about hydro, where do you think the city goes to address the looming $5 million-ish that will be lost from the budget in 2030? Obviously there's probably not a way to make up all that money, but how do you see the city effectively addressing that in a way that maximizes or minimizes the loss?
Of course. So the best option I've seen, and I kind of deeply read Skip Tremble's hydro report from the Hydro Committee in 2022. And then there was a recent work session where they invited another consultant in, and it seems that council is kind of being steered toward the community choice aggregate. I think at this time that's the best solution that's been presented. But I would absolutely, especially if elected and taking office in January, I would push vigorously to see more experts brought in, more consultants brought in, and to make sure that hydro is top of mind as we move into the new year.
So all those issues considered, when it comes to budgeting and these projected double-digit, maybe even 20% tax rate increases, 9% and 7% in the last 2 years were what they were whittled down to. Where do you see a number being acceptable? What type of tax rate do you see as being an acceptable number to go with going forward? And as you said, looking out 5 years, each year you're probably looking at a similar one. So what would you see as being an acceptable tax rate increase?
Ideally, as close to the consumer price index or the tax cap as possible. I will say, staffing cuts absolutely on the table, much needed, considering we added 20 new positions in the 2021 budget or 2022 budget. And that also came down to, we had a budget surplus at the time, but there were some questionable choices made regarding the golf course and other funding sources, and adding on new positions that weren't necessarily needed long term, or adding positions without thinking about the long-term ramifications on our budget. So I know that I'm not mentioning names, but one such thing I've heard too is that, some candidates are willing to go after things like minimum manning in the fire department. We've seen this play out before. It cost an insane amount in legal fees, and seemingly in the past 5 to 6 years, we're obsessed with spending money on lawyers in the city of Watertown. So that's one thing that we can cut right away and make sure that we're just being responsive to the residents and, toning down the temperature and minimizing any drama.
Do you think it's realistic, getting towards that 2% tax cap rate increase? Do you think that's something that the city can accomplish?
I don't know how realistic that may be, but we will definitely try. I don't believe in having the city manager present us with a 25% or a budget carrying a 25% increase in the property tax levy and, or property tax rates, and then whittling it down to 10% and patting ourselves on the back. I believe in strong leadership and saying, give us a budget with, a property tax rate increase of 2%, and then adding back some of those items that we might want to prioritize or that we initially took out, after soliciting feedback from residents. Because if to give a budget next year with a 2% property tax rate increase, there's going to be a lot of pain for residents. Taxpayers will be happy. I know I will be happy, but that's going to cause staff cutbacks, and that's going to cause certain programs and services to go by the wayside. Might be necessary, though, moving forward.
So you'd like to see the city manager take on more of the initiative when it comes to cutting things before presenting city council with the next budget?
Definitely, to start. I don't believe in seeing a budget of 25%, a tax rate increase that large, and then whittling it down. I'd rather we start with significant cuts and then we add back things that we feel that we can't live without, or there's immense pushback. I know the zoo is one.
Well, let's talk about the zoo then.
Yeah.
We just had them in the other night, Mark
Yes.
Irwin, the interim director, and Ken Mix with the Thompson Park Conservancy. Do you think that the rate or the amount of money that the zoo is funded right now is appropriate? Do you think it should be more, should be less?
See, so that's another one of these issues. Is it's not as cut and dry as saying cut things across the board. There's certain things that are assets to the community. I support the zoo. I don't support the amount of funding they were initially seeking, but I think the amount of money that they were granted in council's budget last year was adequate and was reasonable. It's also great to see them, with this New York Times article and then the outpouring of support. I think that's phenomenal. And, going back to the spring when we were having the budget sessions and council chambers were packed with zoo supporters, that comes back to being responsive as an elected official and saying, people in this community really value this asset. So if we're facing these significant cuts, maybe taking it a little easy on the zoo, because that would have an outsized impact. I know one of my big platform ideas is bringing people into Watertown and changing the perception. Getting rid of something like the zoo or cutting it off or making it hard for them to do business. There's a lot of families that utilize the zoo. I myself, school teacher, we had a field trip to the zoo last year and we had a great time. I worry that would send the wrong message to especially military families that, Watertown's not a family-friendly community.
Mm-hmm. Staying in Thompson Park with the golf course, would you be in favor of, and specifically the deed restriction on Ives Hill Country Club, would you be in favor of getting rid of that deed restriction as has been proposed for folks at home? A big part of the purchase of the golf course was that deed restriction, or the golf course in Thompson Park was that deed restriction on Ives Hill to a 9-hole course. So do you think it should be restricted, or do you think that it should be lifted?
So I would be in favor of lifting the deed restriction if the city is compensated as a condition for doing so. Only because, part of this golf course purchase initially was this deed restriction. I understand why the deed restriction was ultimately put in place, because, if we had two 18-hole golf courses in the city, especially one being municipally owned, that would have caused a lot of competition and would have made Thompson Park's golf course even less profitable than it is now, which it has yet to break even, which I will say, lift the deed restriction, but as a condition, the city needs to be compensated for it. And once that does occur, give the Thompson Park golf course one more year to see if it breaks even. And at that point, I would like to see it leased out or even closed.
So you would say a year from now,
Yeah.
if the Thompson Park golf course isn't making money,
Yes.
then you think that it should be...
Yeah, give it one more year to determine its viability. I know that very recently there was a news article that, tournaments for next year are kind of up in the air. That also doesn't necessarily help a business is when, prospective consumers don't know if, they can even utilize it next year. So I would like to see tournaments scheduled. I would like to see one more season to determine if it's a viable business. And then beyond that point, I think it's time to cut ties and move on from the golf course fiasco. Do
you think that it would be able to do that if that kind of hard 1 year time frame is set? As you just alluded to, it would be a hindrance to some folks who might want to schedule something there if there's that uncertainty about its future. So do you think that it has a level playing field when it comes to planning for the next year if it's do or die?
Well, the fact that it's already late October and they've had a lot of inquiries about scheduling these tournaments, it's already a detriment to the business. Some of these folks, I know it was mentioned at a council meeting earlier in the week, some of these folks who have previously scheduled tournaments, as soon as their current tournament's over, they want to schedule and see if it's available next year. So we're already 2-3 months behind on this. But I'd like to see them open it up, schedule tournaments, and then, see the golf course given one more season.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to the other members on City Council, the 3 that will be there in January, no matter who's elected, who will remain on City Council, do you see yourself aligning with anyone who's currently on the board, or do you see yourself as I'm my own man?
Ultimately, I'm an independent voice. But again, any governing body, you need to take a collaborative approach. I will work with anyone on council and anyone else who may be elected with me here in a few weeks, as long as it's in the best interest of the residents and as long as it's placing our residents first and moving our city forward.
Anthony, anything else that we haven't talked about you'd like to talk about or that you think has been a thing that's resonated with voters as you've been going door to door?
One thing that it's kind of my claim to fame. I know we were talking previously. It's hard in a local race where I don't think there's a lot of diversity of opinion. And sometimes you need to stand out a little bit. I pride myself in being strong and being decisive and, again, justifying any positions I may take. I don't believe in dancing around an issue, but I ultimately believe in being responsive and making sure that I'm listening to our residents and placing my best foot forward. With that said, several months ago, there was a discussion on residency. And, to fully invest acclimate yourself to a city and move the city forward, I think you need to be fully invested in the city. With that said, I've brought up the fact that I think in next year's gubernatorial election, there should be a ballot referendum on mayoral governance. So right now we have a city manager form of government in the city of Watertown, which there's pros and cons to each. But one thing that I'd like to see council address is maybe exploring the option of, I know council member Olney talked about expanding council. I don't know if that's the right way to go about it. That's something, again, he's a resident. I value his feedback. That's something worth exploring. But I ultimately would like to see residents given an option to determine, do you want to move away from a city manager form of government into one where the mayor becomes the chief executive officer of the city? With that said, you would still have kind of an administrative assistant, and you would still have a mayor that oversees operations and department heads as well. So that's one such thing I'd really like to see next year in 2026.
What do you think the reason for making that switch would be? Why would you be in favor of doing that?
At a minimum, I'm in favor of the referendum. But I would say, oftentimes if you have a mayor who oversees the operations, the mayor is directly accountable to the citizens. I do value the city manager, Mr. Wagenauer. He does have great credentials. He's qualified for the job. That much is clear. And I think he's been doing an adequate job. I just think that there's more of a connection when your leader, the person who is the chief executive officer, is elected directly by the people and responds directly to the people. Not only that, but lives in the same community that they serve. So again, if we're facing these tax rate increases, our leaders, the ones who are proposing the budgets, should be paying them right alongside all of us.
Mm-hmm. 7, 8 years ago, the city did have a charter commission review panel that looked into potentially doing a strong mayor form of government and doing away with city manager, and they opted to not propose that change. So why do you think something has changed now, or do you think that maybe they should have considered it more strongly at the time?
I believe they should have considered it more strongly at the time. Based off of what I've heard in my research, there were several items kind of all lumped together, and in politics, that's kind of a way of sending something out to fail, is lumping in a bunch of different items and then voting on the whole package together. I personally think that the referendum should be its own item, and that mayoral governance should be its own item, and that would, in my opinion, give the residents, the ultimate choice.
Do you think that it would be any type of restriction then on the candidates who might want to run for governor in a city the size of Watertown? And because then it would become a full-time job. It wouldn't be the situation now where you have a person who you are pulling from maybe another community to be the city manager. And in the past, they have been Watertown residents, but in this situation, that's been kind of waived. So do you think that it would restrict the pool of people who might want that job or even be qualified for that job?
That's one such opinion, but I have a lot of faith in this community. I know a lot of folks in this community, and I have faith that there are an adequate number of well-qualified candidates that would run for mayor in such an instance.
Do you think it would put too much power in the hands of one elected official, whereas now the mayor is essentially the chairman or the chairperson of the board of council members, and the city manager then does sort of the bidding of the council? Do you think that it would put then too much power in the hands of the mayor, or is that something you see as giving the city more direction in this a case like that?
I think given what we're facing in the future, I think that would give the city more direction. But also, when updating the charter to reflect, a change in mayoral governance, mayoral power can be curtailed to an extent. So, strong mayor doesn't mean the mayor has, the last authority. There's still veto power that's at play, and it still pushes for collaboration. If the entire council is against whatever a mayor's doing, the mayor can ultimately be vetoed and overridden.
Anything else you'd like to add on this or any other topic?
I can't think of anything right now, but I will say, early voting starts this Saturday, October 25th at the county building. I believe it's 175 Arsenal Street. I don't know the exact hours, but Election Day is November 4th. There are 6 polling places in the city of Watertown, polling centers. And this year, a big change that I think is worth communicating effectively is that this year, you can vote at any 6 of the polling places. So you don't have to go to the specific one that you're assigned to, even if, your voting registration form says that, you have to go vote at Stone Presbyterian, but you'd rather vote at Midtown Towers. That is an option, and they will print you your ballot, and you can vote at any polling place.
Mm-hmm. All right, Anthony, appreciate your time.
Thank you for having
joining
me.
us, of course. That does it for us on 7 After 6. I'm Garrett Domblewski. Anthony Velasquez. Election Day, November 4th. And as you said, early voting getting started very soon. So go out and vote. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.